Hi, this is Billy Garrettson, and in this video we're going to go over my illustration process. The first thing I'll do is in Photoshop, I'll kind of start working on a really rough sketch. And I adopted a technique from fellow artist Dave Greco, where I use kind of a larger brush to block out a really kind of large, almost silhouette, just so I can start getting an idea of kind of the composition and just an idea for where the details are going to go. And then when I like that silhouette, then I go and I switch to a thin brush and I start to do some line work. And at this point, I don't really kind of have a lot of constraints about the overall footprint of the graphic or the layout. So if you saw, I just kind of explored doing a full body shot, and then I realized, well, I don't know if I was going to get the dynamic pose that I really wanted for the final composition. So I went ahead and I found kind of an interesting stylized crop line with his cape to kind of create this lower border around his body. So I kept him more to a square profile. And when I kind of decided that, then I can kind of go in and flesh the details out just a little bit more. You see that I did maybe like 2 or 3 passes of line art, and each step is meant to kind of just get more and more detail. And at that point, I just kind of give myself a little lighting reference before I take this into Adobe Illustrator, where I vectorize the whole thing. So by hand, I retrace my steps over the line art that I created using vector paths. And this step actually can be really time consuming and pretty tedious. So we're gonna be watching this line art here for a while. There's a couple ways that I handle setting up my paths in line art in Illustrator, and I think lately I've been really favoring more just kind of getting a really kind of clean line art layer and not really constraining myself to having perfect paths. Anyone who uses Illustrator probably knows what that means. So what I'll do is I'll just pretty much, line for line go over all my shapes, and then I'll apply an art brush filter to each line so that it's not this kind of perfect technical line. I like to give it a little thick and thin so it looks a little bit more hand done. I think that definitely helps it feel a little less manufactured, though. That kind of clean, kind of quote unquote perfect look is what I am definitely going for. So here I'm playing with kind of like the hand and the forearm. Like you'll see a number of times in the process, I've actually changed the hand and sword and forearm on that side of his body, just because I haven't been really happy with it. That's what's kind of neat about Illustrator. It's a pretty non-linear process. You can kind of change your mind as you go, while maintaining all the other details you've put down. So I really like that. And now we're going into the flats layer, the flats process, where I have my line art down. I'm really happy with it. I went ahead and I took it from that kind of cad green and I made it brown line art. Now I'm filling in all of the color, the base color tone detail. And this is where I can kind of start getting a sense of, the overall color balance and where the focal points are going to be in terms of color. And this part goes pretty fast, and there's certain details that I added, like the crow insignia, that weren't necessarily there in line art. So I knew they were going to be there, so I went ahead and left room for them. So the next step, after doing the flats, is I kind of go back into the line art, and then I colorize the line art to match, I think, the hue of the flat. So instead of a brown line for the red cape, it's more of a burgundy line. Instead of on the face, instead of a darker brown line for facial details, it's more of a kind of a slightly darker peach. So if you just notice there, I reshaped the front shoulder plate pretty significantly, because as I stepped back and I looked at it, I noticed it wasn't really lining up in terms of like the physical world. Like there wasn't enough clearance for the shoulder plate to be in that particular angle without hitting the shield, etc. So now we're moving on to the next step, and this step I think is pretty much fundamentally where the piece is made, essentially. Like this is where I know whether or not I'm gonna have a lot of trouble moving forward in a piece, or if I'm pretty much on smooth sailing and it's just about detailing. And that's the base tonal layer. So what I did is I laid down kind of a full shadow shape. So I basically took all my flats, I combined them into one shape, gave it a color, applied a multiply blend effect, So it basically looked like the whole thing was in shadow, and right now I'm carving out all of the highlights essentially. So instead of adding shadow to lightness, I'm removing lightness from shadow, and that's kind of an old school trick, like chiaroscuro trick to get a lot of drama in your lighting essentially. So it's almost like everything starts from darkness, and you're basically applying light, and it adds a lot of depth to your piece. So I'm just continuing to kind of detail and shade and adding, fine detail into the shadows and the lighting. The more I go into the shading, I can start to see this element's taking a little bit too much focal presence. This one, I need to push this element a little bit back, or this material doesn't feel like the metal I really want to. And then once I kind of like my shadows, and I can kind of go into the lighting. So now I'm applying a lot of, I guess, fine detail to the tones in the face and skin. So I'm adding a little bit more red, I'm adding a little bit more highlights, giving him some lip tone, all that fun stuff. And here's another example of, I had to kind of go back to the beginning and reshape his hair, because I noticed his hair was a little too tall. I really didn't like some of the wisps that were kind of breaking the silhouette in a weird way. Like in the line art it looked okay, but once you start having tones, it looked like really weird around his head. So I went ahead and I had to go back to the line art stage. Because this is sped up, you really didn't see much of it, but it's kind of cool that really at any point, if you look at something and you don't really like it, you can kind of just isolate that one little thing and restructure it and then keep going. So now, again, I didn't like the shape of the sword, I didn't like the shape of the forearm, the hand, I didn't like the shape of the cape, so I went and I just basically redid it all. I don't like to do that very often because it's incredibly tedious. The way I work in Illustrator is very organized, but it's also, I have tons and tons and tons of objects and paths, and trying to manage all that quickly can really slow your momentum. So now that I've got a lot of, I'm not done with the shading and the tones, but I've got it far enough to know, like, okay, I wanted to kind of know where my light source, my kind of dramatic light source is going to be. So I went and I grabbed a shape I had already made for a different piece, that little kind of runic, arcane symbol, behind him, the little pentagram looking thing. And I put it behind him, and I wanted it to be like kind of this really glowy magic thing, kind of producing a subtle light source from the back. And while I was at it, I kind of started thinking about I don't know, like a layout, as if this was like a comic book cover, a magazine cover, and like coming up with all this text. And I really didn't go with any of that. I thought it was kind of hokey, so I abandoned all that, all the outer text stuff. Okay, so now that I have a background kind of giving me a little bit of lighting information for the rim and the edge and kind of where some of the secondary light source was going to come, I go back in and I finish out all those secondary lights. A little bit more rim on his cheek and nose, kind of fleshing out those bits. It kind of gives me lighting detail for the hilt of his sword. I really definitely struggled, I think, on the sword and shield in terms of lighting. Metals can be really, really, really easy to do in Illustrator because of just how awesome the gradient tool is. But the angles that I had things at really made it difficult because I didn't have very, very kind of clean and cut lighting directions just because of the angles of everything. So I'm coming up to the end of this piece, and really the last thing I do is I take it back into Photoshop for essentially color adjustment, and I favor the selective color adjustment layer to do all my finished color. And that's pretty much it. You see, I took the blues a little bit further down. I try to pop the reds a little bit more, and that's pretty much it. So hopefully you enjoyed that little peek into my process, and I hope you like the finished piece. Thanks.